What are Jews allowed or not allowed? There's a lot of discussion about hiring practices. Is putting Jewish activities on your resume, is it going to hurt someone when they apply for things like med school or School of Social Work? I find it extremely distressing. The fact that I see parallels with things that I study are especially distressing.
Hello, everyone. My name is Frida Weisel, and in this channel, I explore topics related to Judaism, New York City, Yiddish, and more. Today, I'm so looking forward to talk to Anna Shternshis about her amazing work on Jews from the Soviet Union. Anna Shternshis is a professor of Yiddish studies and the director of the Department of Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto, and the author of Soviet and Kosher, When Sonia Met Boris, and the forthcoming book, Jews in the Soviet Union, Post-War Life, Hopes, and Fears. Hello, Anna, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Hi, Frida. Thank you for having me.
So something that I experienced when reading your work in preparation for this interview is I felt very much resonant with your interest in the world, your love for stories, and your love for stories of everyday people. I feel like I have a bit of a similar fascination with Hasidic Jews and everyday people that you bring to Soviet Jewry. To that end, I feel like it might be appropriate to start with your own story, which is also, of course, informing your work.
I was born in Russia, in Moscow, in 1974. And I grew up in a Jewish family. And when we talk about growing up in a Jewish family in a Canadian context, it means like a lot of different things, familiarity with Jewish, maybe tradition, life, I don't know, attending JCC or something like that. So my life was not like that. I knew I was Jewish, and my grandparents, who I remember a little, spoke Yiddish. And I am familiar a little bit with that, but I did not grow up religiously practicing being Jewish. And to me, being Jewish meant dealing with that fact of difference in a Soviet society. I wouldn't say that all of that was negative, although a lot of it was. But, the idea that one is a little bit different from everyone else and not in a good way, that was very important to me. But I started university when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And it's a time when, historians now call it the time of moral panic. And that is when the old way of life has already been destroyed and all ideologies did not make any sense. For example, I don't know, Lenin did not seem like such a cool guy anymore, or this whole kind of idea of Marxism and communism as a future seemed really outdated. But what's instead, that was not yet worked out. So predictably, studying humanities was so unbelievably exciting. So before the Soviet Union collapsed, Jewish people and many other people were attracted to science and to these kind of disciplines, exact science we used to call them, where things made sense. In math, things make sense, in physics and all this. Humanities were all dominated by Marxism, Leninism, a discipline called scientific communism. There was no kind of opportunity, learn new stuff, alternative points of view and all this. So when I started university, all that was wrong, all that was gone, and you could really study humanities from different perspectives. So the competition to get into humanities was much, much higher compared to places like medicine and stuff. So anyway, so I was very excited to get into this university, get into the program that studied history and archives. And I do want to say that at that time, Soviet archives were opened for the first time. And all these documents that condemned Soviet leadership, that opened new perspectives, they just appeared to the surface. So all that every day, I remember in the newspapers was sensation about something. What we thought about Brezhnev was not true. What we thought about Cold War was not true. Things like this. So anyway, unbelievably exciting. And that to start with. But in addition, this was also the first year when Jewish studies as a discipline were allowed to be a part of any university in now former Soviet Union. And I didn't even know about Jewish studies when I got accepted. But then a friend told me that, they are starting the first kind of course, the program of study in Jewish studies, and anyone can join. The only issue is that the classes are in English because Russia didn't have any domestic professors to teach. So anyway, I joined that program. My English was not as good. But I was 17 and arrogant and thought like, how hard could it be? And I started doing this Jewish studies. That was before 1991 was scandalous. Like a Russian doesn't have a neutral word for Jewish. Like if you say the word Yevrei, which is a neutral word supposed to be, like it's a normal word in Russian, my instinct is to say it quieter, to whisper, because like something
Why?
is, off with that. It's coming
Ah,
back, by the way, in Canada too. Like, it's like Jewish is, it becomes a loaded term with a lot of different
ah.
things. Anyway, so I studied that, and it was a very exciting undergraduate program. I learned Yiddish and Hebrew and Jewish history. My professors were from United States, from Israel, from Europe. And I got very excited in thinking about revisiting maybe even history of my own family and my own society, thinking about what it meant, why my family was the way it was, and Jewish families of other people I knew were the way they were. And I wanted to know how the transformation of Jews in Russia that started with today, with kind of the practicing level would be called ultra-Orthodox Jews. That's how the majority of Russian Jews were in 1917. How did it go from that to people like me, I mean, with no association at all between being Jewish and any religious practices. So my dissertation was my MA thesis even was about Soviet Jewish culture of 20s and 30s, and I can tell you more about this. And then it became my doctoral dissertation on the process of how Jews went from ultra-Orthodox to the most Soviet of all Soviet people in the course of like, I don't know, less than 25 years from 1917 to 1941. And that idea that I could get that information for interviewing people, for learning about their trajectories, their points of view, what happened to them, how they made sense of it, that was really crucial to me because when I started that education, the documents were all lies. Only histories, only stories were telling the truth. And
What do you
that
mean by that?
stayed with me. Well, the whole kind of survival in the Soviet Union was all about, I don't know, faking a number of things in your life. Like, for example, if you wanted to your children to have better access to better universities, you would try to correct the ethnicity as recorded in your passport, the internal document, from Jewish into Russian. And then hoping with that way they will be accepted to better universities. So if a historian looks at documents, official documents, they will look and say, oh, this person was Russian with this name. But an oral history will tell you, well, actually, all that stuff is not exactly true. And newspapers were publishing one version of the story, interpretation of events, but people who I interviewed are telling, well, actually, this was this, that, and that. And that idea that private is very different from public, and public is really not what happened. That is the key, I would say, insight to keep in mind when anyone studies Soviet Jewish history. And to me, like this trust in the importance of oral histories and actually talking to people and learning what happened to them, that stayed with me throughout everything that I work on.
Yeah, this was actually something I was wondering about when I was reading your work. What someone who comes from the Soviet Union intuitively knows about hearing the stories of other people from the Soviet Union that someone who, let's say, grew up as an American Jew wouldn't
Yeah,
understand.
yeah.
Like when someone is telling you a story, what are you hearing that you think others wouldn't pick up because they don't come from this background?
Well, it's a very interesting question because it's the way also what they're telling me versus what they would tell an American person, right? So to me, they would assume a lot of knowledge that I know. Like, for example, they would assume that I am totally on board and understanding how one cheats bureaucracy and how one like deals with obstacles like this. I'll give you an example. Like I interviewed tons of people on Brighton Beach when I did worked on my dissertation, later on my book, and I interviewed them in Russian and a lot in Yiddish as well, if they could. And almost every interviewer, person who I interviewed, told me a story of some sort of illegal dealing. Like they would tell me about their kids or themselves working for cash. They would tell me about some shenanigans with immigration. They would tell me about like their kind of modified applications for pensions for Holocaust survivors, like all sorts of things. There's actually a very interesting novel about faking your story for getting pension for Holocaust by Boris Fishman called Second Life. It's just based on those fake out. So it was astonishing to me how I would ask people about their life, and they would like tell me when they would tell me about their extramarital affairs. They would ask me to turn off the recorder, but they were telling me about working for cash or some sort of other shenanigans. Like they really didn't care. So you ask me what I would hear differently. I would say I actually got very different kind of information. But at the same time, maybe they would not tell me things that they would explain to others, and those things would be more interesting. So, one example of that maybe is, I don't know, stories of how they lived a Jewish life despite being in the Soviet Union. And a lot of things I took for granted, like they would say, oh, I went to Jewish school where we were taught not to practice Passover, but then after we came home, we celebrated Passover anyway. And maybe if I ask them, well, more like how exactly did you celebrate? What did you do? What was part of that? If they didn't assume my knowledge, they would have told me that in more detail. Later, I already read those interviews, and sometimes I was able to ask, but most of the time they already were dead. So I never got to hear
Yeah.
some of those kind of stories.
Because you interviewed people who were born before 1929,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
that was my cutoff age.
Well, I want to talk more about your oral histories, but I want to talk more first about your oral history because I know very little about the experience of growing up in Moscow as in the Soviet Union. Can you paint a picture of what your childhood was like?
Well, I grew up in an apartment with a lot of I don't know apartments in that apartment building. I went to a kindergarten and school. I would say I had a very exciting high school. Again, like I started in 1989, we were doing history. And I'm trying to answer your question, bringing this kind of Jewishness in, and I'm like
You
having all
don't
that
you don't have to. You don't
blanking,
you don't have to
all these
you don't have to make it
connections.
Jewish. I'm just trying to visualize like you're in a city. Did
Yeah.
you have siblings?
Yeah. I have a younger sister. She still lives in Russia, and she's a doctor. She actually became a Baal Teshuva and lives an ultra-Orthodox Jewish life with shadel covering her hair and her kids having tzitzis and everything. But we grew up in not in that environment at all. So we went to school. We did piano. We did tons of extracurricular dance, whatever was necessary. I guess the ambition to study was very important to both of us, and my parents really supported that. I would say also, maybe it's something like I try to tell this to my kids, but they don't get it. Like we grew up in today's world, it would be understood as in a very modest household, so without a lot of things. And but it was not like unusual. This is how most people were. And I didn't get to travel abroad till the Soviet Union began collapsing. So that was very exciting to travel to Germany for the first time. And actually, I went to Germany in 1990 with a high school exchange. And that was fascinating to me because I got to see a hospital for German veterans, where the hosting family was. It occurred to me for the first time, wait a second, these are the veterans who were fighting the Soviet Union during World War II. And it didn't like my grandfather fought in the World War II in the Red Army, so it gave me a little pause. But and then we like they looked like this old man, frailing, sick. And when somebody said these are girls from the Soviet Union, they started cursing in Russian. And they said, well, we learned all these words when we were in the Soviet front.
They were showing off. They were not cursing at you. They were showing off.
Oh, no, of course, they were showing up.
They were showing off.
Yeah,
Did you experience anti-Semitism? In what ways was your childhood Soviet?
in all ways. I did not grow up in a family that questioned rules. We were not, dissidents, refuseniks, or people who were like fighting for a better society. We listened to the radio. Of course, it was not like watched television, although my family didn't have television until after the Soviet Union collapsed. A little poverty here. I would say that the idea that Soviet system was flawed was not foreign to me, but the idea that one could change that somehow, that seemed really, really strange. I would also say, like, lots of reading. It was very important to us. And, interesting fact, like, my family had lots of books, including this very hard to get series of masterpieces of world literature, which had a translation of Sholem Aleichem as one of the volumes. And I remember my mother saying to me, well, don't read it, such low level literature, like, read something better. And that became my
Wow.
life. I would say, oh, and anti-Semitism, you ask. So a little bit in school, like I remember in second grade, a boy didn't want to sit next to me because he said he wouldn't want to sit next to a Jew. And, I told my mother, and my mother said, oh, don't pay attention to him. But she, I think, was upset. So she took me to the store and bought me a watch. And it was, I really remember that watch. It was like so exciting to have a watch because nobody had a watch. And that was fun. And my mother said, I don't remember that when my sister and I were in kindergarten, we were yelling at each other, Jew. We were insulting each other because we heard it in kindergarten. We thought this was a curse word. And
Wow.
that's when they told us, you're actually Jewish. And that was so shocking. That we were both upset. I don't remember any of that, but my mother said that this was how we found out about being Jewish. From that insult, from the insulting each other. I do want to say that I remember when the Soviet Union collapsed, and I was very young and just finished high school, started university, and I remember that time is kind of ambivalently because on one hand, my family went into a deeper poverty because my mother's a doctor, my father's a computer scientist, and they both lost their jobs. And to support themselves, they started like selling some Chinese clothes that were imported into Russia in subway crossings. And sometimes I even helped them with that. And it was a, how shall I put it, very sudden shift to occupation, all this. And, when I tell the story now, when I think about this, it's like, oh my God, like, how could we do it? But I don't remember that time as hardship. I remember that time as studying in university, learning about all these secrets of the past, hanging out with my friends. Also, this was the time when things like cafes and restaurant opened. Before that, like I don't think I've ever been to a restaurant before I was at the age of I don't know, 18, or maybe even later, because it was not part of Russian culture. And an idea that you can eat somewhere that's not your home, like that was exciting. Also, the borders opened, opportunities opened. So now, when Soviet historians are talking about 90s, they talk about violent 90s, a lawless 90s. And I have a lot of conversations right now with my friends about with the new president and this whole kind of idea of oligarchs taking over the country. People are asking me what it was like when oligarchs took over the country in the Soviet Union. What did it mean for people? And because a lot of people are worried that this is coming to the States, like this power concentrated in a few wealthy families, and they just do whatever they want. And I do remember violence in the streets and unsafe to walk alone at night, and poverty for most people, but extreme wealth for others. Businesses such as guards, security, oh my God, they just thrived. I remember some of my school friends, university friends, on a side, especially those who were athletes, they were working as bodyguards for those new nouveau-riches. They were the ones who could afford to buy like new things. So, for example, what were the new things that were very exciting? candy bars, like Mars candy bar and Snickers candy bar. So of course we tried that only in the 1990s. And I remember I had that boyfriend in 1992, and he like got some sort of gig. And anyway, so as a gift, he bought me that Mars bar. And I said, I'm not going to eat it. I'm just going to take it to, I'm going to take it home. And I took it home. My parents were so excited. My sister, we cut it into 4 parts and we tried it for the first time. It was so like amazing. So anyway, and my mother says, oh, he's a keeper. He's a keeper. That's an amazing present. When I tell this story, like, does it sound like pathetic, depressed?
No, it's so
I
cute.
remember that as happy is really, really exciting. And even this thing, like it's unsafe to walk in the city. But then, like all these boys who walked you home, and it was also like a thing, and the subway closes at 1, and they have to get the 1 in the morning, and they have to get there in time. So I guess being young does not hurt,
Yeah.
when one lives through these things. But I would say, because you cover your program covers Jewish stories, that I associate all these excitements of the 90s also with being Jewish, because that was the time when saying that I'm studying Jewish studies, I said it out loud. And it was interesting. It was a conversation. It's not something that you whisper. And to me, more we learned about a new way of life, a new system, and even when I went to study at Oxford to do my PhD and all this, like that association with Jewish, and especially Jewish studies and excitement, it stayed with me for life, even now.
Were your parents also excited about you studying Jewish studies when they're like struggling? I mean, you're going into the humanities. It's like getting a liberal arts degree
I
when your
know, I
parents don't
know.
have money.
I asked my mother about this like later in life, and because I remember them supporting me 100%. And I said, what, like, weren't you worried? Didn't you want me to go study medicine like I could? And she said, at that time, we didn't know what the future will be like because everything collapsed and it was not clear how would a person make money. So she said, you started studying Yiddish and you started like doing your homework, and we've heard you like, speaking, asking questions. And she says, it reminded me of my parents, my father too. And it was so heartwarming. And my father even said, I don't remember his mother, my grandmother. And he said, she would be so proud of you of doing that stuff. So my parents were very, very supportive of of this very unpractical choices. And now, of course, when I tell my own kids, you should study something that will give you a career, I say, well, you studied Yiddish. What authority do you have?
Are your parents still in Russia?
Yeah, and my sister too. And her oldest son is now in Canada here with me. He's an international student at the University of Toronto. And let's just say that I would say that for him, wearing his kippah and wearing his tzitzis outside of his pants was a little bit safer in Moscow than it is here on campus.
Is that true? Is that
That
so?
is my impression. So after a week or two here on campus, I asked him to put a hat on top of his kippah and put tzitzis inside.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there is direct danger of violence or anything like this, but I don't feel super safe for him
Yeah.
doing that.
How do you make sense of this kind of moment?
Well, I am very upset about this. It actually bothers me so much because I remember the transition from hiding being Jewish and from all from like no being Jewish as being a secret, being a disability. My whole like scholarship is about studying what it's like to be Jewish in the Soviet Union, and my conclusion is that you grew up with a disability. This is the like disability, and you have to overcome it to learn to live with this and all this. So. And then when I came to Canada and I saw all these JCCs and synagogues with big signs down the street and also names of donors on top of buildings, unapologetic, like I was shocked. Like I've never seen anything like this. And it was funny. Everyone he was complaining about anti-Semitism, and I'm like, look at all these buildings. Look at this really public Jewish life. Jerry Seinfeld saying he's Jewish out loud. Like I mean, we've had a lot of Jewish actors and directors and public figures. They didn't speak out loud that they were Jewish. We knew, we took pride, but this was not a thing. So anyway, I remember the transitioning from that hiding into very public praise, but now this association of Jews and I don't know, somehow anti-progressive association of Jews and anti-progressive Jews and something that I witness a lot in academia, that Jewish people have to first explain where they stand before they
Yeah.
speak. Like they would say things like, my grandparents are Holocaust survivors, my parents are from Israel, and I condemn, this, and this. So you can't just say I condemn. You have to explain your positionality, no matter where you are. I also often feel people like looking and expecting you to say something or not say something about that. And I find it extremely, extremely distressing.
Yeah.
The fact that I see parallels with things that I study are especially distressing.
Like what? Can you talk more?
Well, like what? Discussion of what it means to be, like, what are Jews allowed or not allowed to do? What is the expectation? So, thinking about there's a lot of discussion about, like, I don't know, hiring practices. Is being Jewish, is putting Jewish activities on your resume, is it going to hurt someone when they apply for things like med school, or no, maybe not business school, but maybe like School of Social Work or things like this? Or are they going to be neutral? Whoever had those discussions 10 years ago, what I mean? Like, or even 5 years ago, this was not on the horizon. And now the advice people get is that remove all your Jewish camp and counseling jobs, remove all your volunteering for synagogues, because that could jeopardize your chances of getting a job. This is a direct flashback to lives of my parents. I already did not see that, but I studied that and I know it very well. Why does it have to be the future here? That is really hard to comprehend. And I would also say, I talk a lot to social scientists and my other colleagues who study these things, is that this is all anecdotal evidence. And maybe it's not like this. Maybe people imagine that these restrictions exist. And maybe it's true, but I do know that there was not a single law in the Soviet Union that allowed restrictions on Jewish choices, professional, like educational, this. And yet those unwritten laws and expectations played a much more important role compared to what existed. So that worries me,
Yeah.
for sure.
But what do you think are like the lessons of history that people don't know that you wish they knew when things are playing out now? Which, of course, I experience as well. I know what you're talking about with the sense of being Jewish is a liability and you have to equivocate and explain your position and so
Yeah.
on. But I don't see it in a historical context. Like I don't place it, or I would say definitely not in the historical context that I think you place it in. So I'm wondering if you can tell the historical story that you're framing what you're seeing play out now, and maybe what lessons of the future you're seeing.
It's very hard to do lessons. I will give you one more example of parallels that I was actually just writing about, like literally last week, for this new book about post-war Jewish life in the Soviet Union. It's just like I was proofreading it, and I saw this paragraph I wrote that the biggest blow to Jewish life after World War II in the Soviet Union came to the creative sectors. Journalists, writers, actors, public figures, they were the ones who were fired from their jobs, condemned for being cosmopolitans. That's how they called Zionists at that time. They never condemned, by the way, for being Jewish, cosmopolitans. So today they also don't condemn being Jewish, and even there's also whole discussion that it's not anti-Semitism and all this. So now it's anti-Zionism, but it's similar, not the same, but similar. The creative sectors are bad. Science sectors are better because, there's tons of resources invested in physics and building this nuclear weapons and all this stuff. So they didn't want to fire some people because they were Jewish, because they needed talent. But in humanities, public spheres, it was okay. And this idea that nothing can help a person, no matter what they've done, just because of how, in what families they were born. I mean, that really resonates right now, because if we start thinking, where is it harder for Jews right now, like this second, March 6th, 2025? And if we have to name a few areas, it will be academia, it will be the art world, maybe music world, literary world, like with writers and stuff. We hear so many stories about writers having trouble, Jewish writers having trouble placing their work, protests against prizes. Like, I mean, I don't know, you know all this better than I do. So, to me, if I say like, I don't know, it's like, oh my God, that's happened in the Soviet Union, 1948. It's like, how could you compare Stalin and what's going on in Canada today? It's two different things, completely different, all this. And I think people are arrogant that way, thinking sometimes that, oh, something like this could never happen here, or we are somehow evolved in the West much better than those people, poor people, deprived people in Eastern Europe, and this, because like we're so much more
Advanced.
yeah, exactly, advanced in everything. And I think a little humility, understanding that, things like this can happen. And maybe I am overreacting even with this, some of the other things, because I cannot help it. But, like every time there is a conversation about war with Canada from a current US president, I start like worrying, because, when Russia invaded Ukraine, no Russian and no Ukrainian person could imagine that it would happen like 2 days before it happened. So whenever I articulate those fears to very close friends and my family, say, oh, like US and Canada can never fight the war, like it could never happen. And I don't know, like when you study history, like who said that recently? I was talking to, I heard it, a talk by my colleague David Hirsch from UK, and he said anti-Semitism always comes as a shock. And I thought this is very interesting. It is always as a shock. So this kind of stuff, it's always unexpected, and then it hits you. It's like, oh yeah, of course, we saw all the things that were leading to that. So I don't think studying history and learning lessons will prevent necessarily. It's like it's a remedy for creating better society, but it's definitely not a terrible way to make sense of what's going on now.
You know, what's really interesting about this moment to me is it seems everyone is calling everyone a Nazi, and everyone is screaming at each other that they are like, because they are not politically aligned, they are the beginning of the end of like this terrible calamity. And yet at the same time, it seems to me that there's a lot of ignorance around the past.
Yeah, and that Nazi thing, you're absolutely right. Like the biggest problem in schools was not the biggest problem, one of the problems, kids kept drawing swastikas. I was like, what is with the swastika? What's the appeal of swastika? And I think for them, it's like, oh, this will get adults mad for sure. And maybe for a good reason, but they don't think about that. And calling everyone Nazi, also calling everyone anti-Semite, also calling everyone, I don't know, a fascist and all this, that doesn't help anything. But at the same time, not thinking about that Nazism happened in such a society that's completely immune from all this is also a big mistake. My colleague Doris Bergen wrote this really important book called War and Genocide, Concise History of the Holocaust, War and Genocide, where she explained that genocides always happen step by step. It's never like everything was fine and then like there's Nazism. It's just little things, little restrictions, little society getting ready for things, and then a little more, and then finally, when the final step is taken, it's not even that such a big deal because we already were preparing for that. So that idea that even the worst human societies happen step by step. That's very interesting and important. And I think even for Soviets, going with the thinking about what happened after the Russian Revolution, and what Soviets were saying, that religion is separate from the state. A lot of people agreed with this, who wanted religion to be in charge of that. But then it went one step further, saying, well, actually, religion are people. So all these priests and all these rabbis and all these mullahs, they just can't get into our projects, so they have to be somehow removed from public sphere, and arrests, deportations, exiles. And you could say, oh, well, I'm not a rabbi, so I'm okay. And then, little more, the schools. So we have to teach kids better, and let's teach them how observing Jewish laws and Jewish life is actually hurting them. And, you could say, okay, they learn in school and family will teach them differently. But gradually, step by step, you get a society where understanding what it means to be a human being or a Jew or any other identities is completely different from where you started 25 years ago. And then it moves on.
Yeah. Can you talk about actually how in Soviet society, the Soviet approach to religion evolved, especially vis-a-vis Yiddish language efforts to combat religion?
So that's how my interest in that started, because Yiddish to me at first was associated with the language of my grandmother. And my grandmother used to sing this song in Yiddish. It had those words, "Funale meidle his belke b'mishena." And it means from all the girls, Belka is
Is the
the most
prettiest.
beautiful one. So my mother's name is Bella. So I always assumed that this was a song about my mother and my mother too. And of course, turns out this was not a song about my mother as much as, we all wanted to believe that. But it was a song about a guy who liked that girl Belka, but she rejected him because he was not literate. So she says to him in a song, if you know how to read books, then I would consider dating you, but you are not a proper communist, so not so away with you. And I learned all these words actually many years after my grandmother died. I did not understand everything she sang. I remember the first line. And, so this idea of how a Yiddish song was actually talking about reading books, but not the Jewish books, but anti-Jewish books, it was actually my family history. But to answer your question more directly, is Soviets put a lot of efforts into delivering the message of their ideology in a language that people that lived in the Soviet Union spoke at home. So developing mother tongues, developing literature in mother tongues was really important to them, including Yiddish.
What years are we talking?
We're talking 1917 to 19 maybe 28, and even all the way into the 30s. And the idea was that people will understand the advantages of Soviet ideology if they explained in the language they speak. So for Jews, it was Yiddish. The majority of Soviet Jews who lived especially in smaller towns, but even in bigger cities, spoke Yiddish. So they invested tons of resources into delivering that message in Yiddish. So what did it mean? Schools, Jewish schools, were free, and they taught in Yiddish. What they taught is a whole separate question, but the idea of free Jewish schools delivering that, serving that population was there. Yiddish theaters, super important. Soviets loved theater. They thought it was an excellent propaganda vehicle, and they could teach a lot of people, especially illiterate people, and illiteracy was a huge problem in the Soviet Union in the 20s, ideas through theater. So that resulted in investment into Yiddish theater as well. And before the war, I want to say there were 40 state-sponsored Yiddish theaters in the Soviet Union. Whereas Volksbühne in New York is trying to survive, doing this, and this. Here's 40 state-sponsored Yiddish theater with full budget and everything and buildings serving that population. Trade unions in Yiddish, Yiddish community centers, Yiddish periodicals, newspapers, journals, and all this. So all that stuff exists. But of course, it's really important to look what's inside them. And then what's inside them is the message that being Jewish in the past caused nothing but trouble for Jews. They suffered from persecution, from anti-Semitism, from pogroms. Their religious leaders took advantage of them by making them buy really expensive kosher food, by spending money on Shabbat candles, by making them sick. Mikvahs was a big point of attack because they were portrayed as filled with parasites and bacteria and diseases. Tons of stories also about how little babies got sick from the dirty nails of moles who were conducting circumcision. So a lot of this, it's unhealthy, it's hurtful, it also makes you poor, and it makes you hate non-Jews. So Yiddish culture was created with the goal to destroy itself through its own development. And on the surface, it didn't look like this right away. Like all these Yiddish writers, for example, who left the Soviet Union in fear of violence after the Russian Revolution, like lived in poverty in Berlin in the 20s, they came back later in the 20s when Stalin offered them apartments, paid salaries, positions of power, like Peretz Markish, David Bergelson. They came back from Berlin and they were building this new Yiddish culture. And, they were sympathetic to the ideas of communism. I mean, equality, ideas that you can develop your culture, but it will be Soviet in content and it will still be with people that was appealing to them. So the combination of those things created this very strange phenomenon of like really widespread, very well-funded Yiddish culture. I would say arguably the most well-funded and widespread Yiddish culture in the world, right? In the Soviet Union, 1920s and even 1930s. But the content of it was gradually, step by step, removing Jewish stuff from it. But if we start thinking about, like, I don't know, what's going on in Germany in 1933, and what's going on with Jews, or 1934 and 35, and what's going on in Jews in the Soviet Union with them getting all kind of advantages of signing up to Soviet projects, studying wherever they wanted, living where they wanted, even developing Yiddish and enjoying Yiddish theater if they wanted, then it's kind of like doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't make sense to think of it as fully suppressive regime. And this is why it's so important to always look inside. I will give you an example of that has nothing to do with Yiddish culture, but maybe it will entertain you and our viewers. And that is, the opposite of how, Chabad Lubavitch is very interesting in doing outreach for Russian Jews. And they take a lot of pride in Kiruv, right? Like in getting all these people inside synagogues and all these Soviet Jews, like returning, so to say, with their roots and stuff. So on the surface, when you see a Chabad shul, and you see people, women dressed in traditional modest clothing and men like with the kippahs and stuff, you think, wow, like the revival. But once you actually go inside and you hear what people talk about, then this revival might not seem that exciting. I was just a few years ago at the bar mitzvah of a friend of mine and in the Lubavitch shul, and the boy was downstairs with his father and some men, and all the women were on a balcony watching, what's going on. And of course, like nobody knows what's happening there. And one woman asks another, so what's happening? And another one says to her, it's all in Russian. I says to her, well, now they're saying in the name of the Father and the Son and Holy Spirit. So she's like explaining all this. So I was thinking, like if an observer comes in from another planet who doesn't speak Russian, it's like, wow, like look at all this going on. But if you talk, you see it's like, yeah, maybe it's not exactly the meaning that, the hope is there will be.
That's funny. I've heard, not to sidetrack you, but I've heard that ex-Soviet Jews like the experience of religious life when they are involved in Jewish life. They like the full feeling, and the rest of the time they're rather not so much engaged with their Judaism. Like they don't like a reformed temple. No, it has to have
Yeah.
the full cultural feel.
I have a theory on that for sure, because I think they are drawn to Chabad and to Orthodox Judaism as the proper Judaism because it's most reminiscent of Orthodox Church. Orthodox Church, which was the only kind of public religion with which people were familiar, for Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, lots of Russian literature, which was Soviet secular religion. Orthodox Church has all these people with long beards, with very structured ritual. And Orthodox services are like that. Like, in
Interesting.
Orthodox Church, the service is in Old Slavonic, so you don't understand what's going on. So in a synagogue, it's in Hebrew, so you also don't understand. So it's kind of mystery, distance, looks, and all this reminds of proper religion. Whereas Reform and conservative, like, kind of seems strange. But also it doesn't help that the messaging from Orthodox communities that do kiruv is that it's reform is worse than converting. Like this is what they hear too. So yeah.
It's interesting the Christianity connection for Jews from the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
and also the fluidity with which they define Judaism in your interviews. For instance, you have a very funny scene in your book where you're in a retirement home in Germany and you're having a meal with a bunch of people who are arguing how to make pork kosher. And some are like, you can't, and you're not a proper Jew. And other are like, you definitely can. I know from experience that you can. But this is just one piece of this like fluid idea of Judaism, some of which in your work came through as a lot of it coming from Christianity as well.
I even have an article which I called Kaddish in a Church about how people who were interviewed who were in their 80s, like in the early 2000s, wanted to say commemorative prayer for their deceased parent. And they knew that they wanted to do this, but they didn't know how to do it in synagogue. And when they come to synagogue, like they don't know where to go, it's not clear who to ask. So instead, they go to church where everything is clear. You can buy a candle, light it, and say a prayer in your own words, and nobody will say anything to you. And I've documented that phenomenon in Moscow that all these people go and say Kaddish, and they even know the word Kaddish, and they go to Orthodox Church and do it. And, I asked them about what it means for them and all this, and they said, do you think God cares where I say Kaddish to my mother who was killed, in the Holocaust, like, or my grandparents? Like, I don't think God cares. And that discussion of fluidity of Christianity is very important to them. I recorded a lot of kind of, I don't know, talking about how Jesus was Jewish. So it's, and that's important. Everyone who was Jewish is important because that's a source of pride. Jesus was Jewish. A lot of people, Jews, actually converted to Christianity in the 60s and 70s in the Soviet Union. And the idea was that that act made them feel closer to being Jewish. I remember even,
Really
yeah. I remember when
interesting.
I was in high school. Now I'll tell you a story about high school. When I was in high school, the discussion was like, where do you meet a nice Jewish boy? And the where you meet a nice Jewish boy was a church led by Alexander Mein, who was an Orthodox priest, not even converted, who was, I don't know if you can convert, actually, baptized into Orthodox Church, super charismatic. And the idea that he had this church where young people were welcome was very exciting. And the majority of those young people were Jewish. So this idea that you have to go to a synagogue to meet Jews was okay, but it was not the only option. That Alexander Maintank was also very well known, and he was killed in, I think, 1990, 1991. So, and it was a huge tragedy. But that idea of a church that's that welcomes Jews was I didn't see any contradiction with it. I learned about contradiction that Jews do not believe in Jesus. I learned about this, oh my God, so much later in life. I did not know that this was not the case.
Did you not grow up knowing of the negative history between of Christian persecution of Jews, like the
Like growing
Crusades?
up, not from my education, not really. I mean, no, like, listen, like, I haven't learned anything about Jews. Like, like
Yeah.
even in history classes, like, I remember in grade 8, or grade 7, we had one line about medieval Spain, and it said that there were different people living there, and there was comas who lived there, and one of those comas was Yevrei, Jews. And I remember a friend of mine who was Jewish and I were discussing, like, if we're asked to read from the book, should we read this word? Should we skip this word? This was the only time the word Jewish actually came up in my education. So I didn't know anything about Crusades. I didn't know anything about any of that. The only thing maybe that came up is I remember a friend asked me at the age of 8 or 9, the Jews, how much blood goes into the matzah? And I went ask my mother, and she said, we don't put blood in matzah. And it's like, well, but he said, and what was astonishing to me now is like, how did he even know about matzah? Even I barely knew what matzah was because like my grandmother had it. I thought everyone had it for May Day because this was when Passover was more or less, so we didn't do it. I just remember we always went to grandma for May Day, which is May 1st, and she would always serve this matzah and some gefilte fish and like all these other things. And I thought everyone had that for May Day, and then it was much later, like really, really much later, I realized that this was a Jewish thing.
But you didn't know to look for a nice Jewish boy? Was that expected?
But that was important.
That was important?
That was important, and that was important even to my parents. But listen, I was 15, so But so that was not about marriage, but that conversation existed.
Did the boy with the Mars bar, was he Jewish?
I don't think so. No, he was not Jewish. But he was not marriage material.
Oh, okay.
That was
It was just good for candy.
Right. But I do want to say, like, why a Jewish boy? It was only one reason. The reason was that why worry about anti-Semitism in the family? And that was the explanation. So, that I heard both from my parents and I heard it from hundreds of people who I interviewed. That the reason is not to create a family, not to, I don't know, like all these other things that, my kids learn in Jewish Sunday school here, about multiplying Jewish people and all this. The only reason was why, if the person is not Jewish, they almost always are an anti-Semite. And why would you want to worry about that in a family? Mm-hmm. So that's the only reason Jewish boy.
There wasn't a sense that you need a cultural compatibility, like...
No, because our culture was all the same.
Yeah, because there was no cultural... Yeah. No. Interesting. I want to talk more. We're coming on the hour, and I had a feeling I'm not going to get to a lot of things we want to talk about because there's so much to talk about. But I do want to talk a little bit about your experience collecting oral histories.
Yeah.
What it was like, and like... When we read your books, we get very interesting people's stories. I want to know your experience of listening to people.
I remember when I started this work, I came to New York, actually, I was a grad student in England, and I got this fellowship at YIVA to look at some documents. And I arrived, and I went to YIVA, and they said, actually, it's renovated. And you have no access to any of the documents. It's like, what am I going to do? And then I thought, okay, I'm going to improvise. And instead of looking at documents, I'm going to go interview people. And to do that, like, where do you even find them? Somebody said to me, just walk on Brighton Beach and talk to them on benches. And I tried, but this was not an in-depth conversation. So I did an ad in the Russian language newspaper where I said, like, if you want to talk to a graduate student about your life in the Soviet Union, please call me. And my phone was bursting with messages. People really wanted to talk. And I said, especially if you speak Yiddish, because at that time I thought I would only write about Yiddish. Like, one thing that I was thinking about is I was amazed of how much history each person had and how much of it was hidden from themselves, from their children, from their neighbors. Like, I was thinking about so many secrets that people had. And I was thinking that maybe being Jewish for them, for that generation, and even for mine, was to keep secrets And to have so many, everything one does is a little bit secret, and you don't know whether you're allowed to talk or not allowed to talk. But towards the end of people's life, they want to share what happened to them. They want to leave legacy and stuff. And I was often the first person they talked about all these things because I got them before Spielberg got them with all the structured questions and also next question.
Production. Yeah.
Forget about all this reminiscence. So one thing that struck me in New York at that time is how much Yiddish they spoke. Like, I did not expect fluent Yiddish, long conversations from all these non-Yiddishists. To me, Yiddish was all of these hip New Yorkers who wanted to reject the traditional Jewish upbringing and were doing Yiddish to, I don't know, as resistance. And those people, they didn't speak Yiddish, I don't know, for 60 years. And then I come in and they just like telling me all these stories and all these details of their way of life. I also remember thinking how many contradictions were living within one person. So when one of the people I interviewed said to me, explained this whole juxtaposition, how his father worked and it's called militant godless committee, and his job was to fight against Jewish religion. So fight against rabbis, fight against kosher meat slaughter, shochtim, and do all this. But it didn't pay so much. So on a side, he was making money as an assistant in the matzah bakery. So I first thought, when he told me this, I thought, okay, explain that to me again. This is his day job and this is his side gig. It's like, and he said, well, it was a Soviet way of life, but it was all kosher. And this what gave me the idea of a Soviet and kosher, because it was a Soviet way of life and it was all kosher. So I think that every person almost that I interviewed had an alternative view or insight into what the transformation of Soviet life and Jewish life was in those small towns. I would also say that maybe it sounds a little banal, I don't know, but the idea of like, I don't know how much history was in their love stories, in their family stories, in their choosing, I don't know, professions and places to live. I found that stories about love and families had a lot more Jewishness in them compared to when I directly asked them, so, did you celebrate Jewish holidays? And this was my big insight, that whenever I asked them, did you celebrate Jewish holidays? Did you celebrate Shabbat? Did you eat kosher food? They just shut down for me because that reminded them of interviews in Jewish communities that wanted to confirm that they're Jewish. But then I asked them, tell me about how you met your wife, all these questions about, whether she's Jewish, what can she cook, how would the neighbors do, also what happened to them during the Holocaust. That came up right away. Oh, and another thing was this. So I interviewed people for my first project. I didn't want to touch the war. I only wanted to talk about 1920s and 30s. I thought war was too upsetting, even for me. Like my grandmother's 11 siblings were killed in communist Podolsk region of Ukraine. I don't even know the name of my grandmother's grandmother. Like she was I think also killed, but earlier from a pogrom. My grandmother was an orphan since she was 1 year old. Anyway, I didn't want to touch any of that. I wanted fun things. I wanted to know what my grandmother's song was about, like, like all this stuff. And when I came to people's home and I would tell them, tell me about your parents, first of all, they started crying. And second, they wanted to talk for an hour what happened to parents, how they were murdered. And at that time, I realized I can't write that history without learning about the war. And they cannot tell me about before the war because they needed to tell me what happened to them during the war. And that became, by the way, my second book and later like tons of my other studies, because I realized that I cannot apply my whatever I want to know into their life. And the importance of World War II as what it meant for that generation, that also came to me through these interviews. But then, of course, there were tons of funny stories. Like, you always have to eat during those interviews. Like you eat. And
Eat? They serve you food?
oh my God.
What do they serve you?
Oh my, well, it depends. So some people just cookies, other people make the whole dinner, and yet other people make interesting things. Like I interviewed this woman in Brooklyn. She made fish choned. And I'm like, what's fish choned? I mean, because remember, I don't know everything. In fact, I know very little. And she's like, well, fish choned is you always make for Shabbos. And I'm like, really? From fish? And she said, yeah, you take little fish and you have to, keep it all night in a very low temperature. And then you get it like canned sardines. That's the taste. And it's like, I tried it. It's like delicious. And I said to her, how did you learn it? And we went on and on with her family history and all that stuff. So that was a matter of pride. So,
Interesting. I've
yeah.
never heard of fish
Oh,
jolt.
really? I
Yeah.
mean, later, like once I started writing down, I mean, I apparently in some, I forget where she was from some area of Ukraine, it's very widespread. And it tastes, well, in my view, I don't really like chont, but that fish chont was very, very good.
Really?
Maybe if people like chont, they won't appreciate that. And
Yeah,
I and
I
another
hear.
thing about food, I heard a lot of stories, especially from women about, yeah, so I had that trick. Okay, so I'm not going to ask them about Shabbat, but I'm going to ask them about Jewish food. So maybe that would get me into it. And what I noticed that was also a bad idea because they would tell me a lot of stories about food, but every time they would tell me about Jewish food, they would also tell me about anti-Semitism. So a woman I interviewed, I think in Germany, she had that recipe for cherry dumplings. And it was very special recipe from her grandmother and from grandmother. It's like really exciting cherry dumplings that you make pareve. Of course, she didn't know that word, but I understood this was the whole point of those dumplings. And then she said, when my husband just came back from the war and promotion, and he said, I'm inviting everyone to our house and you have to make cherry dumplings. And she had like this whole story of how she sold everything she had to buy a bucket of those cherries and make all that stuff. And it was, instead of story of happiness for her husband promotion, it was a story of
Of
suffering.
sacrifice.
And and then I was like, interesting, is she that grumpy? And then I went back to all my interviews and I started looking, thinking, wait a second. Every time fish chol, cherry dumplings, challah, or herring, like whatever they ate associating with Jewish came up, next story would be about either death or anti-Semitism. So that was an observation that really helped me to figure out how people make sense of their Jewishness. And even good things are bad things.
So again, can you explain the chain of thoughts? What do you think made them tell stories of death after stories of food?
Because stories, if it was a story of Jewish food, then being Jewish is a story always of hardship. And
Uh,
being Jewish is associated with nothing positive. So they couldn't find, so they're thinking, okay, what else can I tell you that's Jewish?
uh,
From a good thing about food, it's always either death and the Holocaust, or my son didn't get into his preferred school of choice, or people were harassing me for being Jewish and asked me where my gold was. And it's funny, like I recorded that story of a woman who said that she would make this sweet and sour meat, and her husband would always invite the colleagues in. And the colleagues really was saying, oh, these Jews, when are you going to go to your Israel? And we're all like saying things like this. And I said to her, why would you keep inviting them over if they were so mean to you? And she said to me, girl, if I did not invite them over, who would I be friends with? And I was like, oh my God, this is like so whatever. I was thinking, like, how can one live like this? Well, now it's 2025. I
yeah,
understand her. I understand her. You have to live with a certain degree of hostility to Jews if you want to live
yeah.
and communicate with other people. Like, there's no way to just pretend to handpick everyone who is not anti. You know what I mean? Like I understand that point of view
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, I
That's
hear.
depressing.
Yeah, that's very depressing. We started with food and now we're at a depressing story.
See,
See, we're
told you how it goes.
I know how it goes now. Well, more depressing stuff. I want to wrap up actually the interview by talking about the Holocaust, which ultimately you did do a lot of work on. Yeah. Can you share about that?
So, that, well, a number of things. So, my book on Sonia Met Boris, I decided to do it through the prism of love and work. And, a lot of family creation, a lot of separation and reunions and all this stuff happened during the war. And I wrote about three experiences which Soviet Jews went through, either service in the combat or living under the German occupations and surviving Holocaust, or escape to the Soviet rear through the prism of those choices and opportunities. So it is a history of Holocaust in the Soviet Union, but of course through the eyes of survivors, people who made it and people who lived long enough to tell the story. That was my first work on that topic. But then another kind of minor miracle happened. I was working on another project, and by accident, I came across a large collection of the documents, Yiddish documents in the manuscript department of the Ukrainian National Library. And these were songs created in Ukraine, collected in Ukraine between 1944 and 1947 from people who lived or died through either Holocaust or service in the army or surviving in the Soviet rear, like in Siberia, Central Asia, and all that. And these were songs collected by Soviet ethnomusicologist Moisei Beregovsky, who himself survived the war in Ufa, in eastern part of Russia. He was not close to the border, but his parents were killed in Babi Yar and Kiev. And anyway, so he spent World War II collecting these texts of Yiddish songs that people wrote as violence unfolded.
Like
So,
how? Can you explain? Like where are people writing these?
some people ended up in occupied Ukraine, and some parts of Ukraine were delegated for occupation to the Romanian army. So and they created ghettos. So Germans created ghettos in Poland, and in the Soviet Union, parts that were Germans invaded, they did not really create ghettos. They started killing people right away. So the survival rate of Jews in German occupied Ukraine was less than 1%. So shooting, like the historians call it Holocaust by bullets. But some parts of Ukraine, such as places in Vinnytsia region of Ukraine, were delegated for occupation to the Romanian army. And the Romanians did not kill all Jews right away. Instead, they used some of them to work on some things they needed to be done, like clothes making or some others, so bridge building sometimes and things like this. So most people still died there, usually from starvation and diseases, but some survived. So once those ghettos were liberated by the Red Army in 1944, survivors were interviewed by both of those Red Army soldiers, but later also interviewed by Moisei Beregovsky, who was this folklorist and musicologist who traveled to Ukraine to collect, to find survivors and record their stories. And one thing I need to say about history of that is that Soviets really were very suspicious of civilians who survived under the occupation because they believed that they survived because they collaborated with the enemy, especially if they were Jews. And because the Jews did not have much chance. So people were afraid to talk to Moisei Beregovsky and to tell him what really happened to them. So he got nowhere with that project. But he was also not a musicologist. So he would ask them, can you sing me a song? Do you know any Yiddish songs? And this is how he recorded hundreds of Yiddish songs that were created under the occupation in those ghettos, usually by amateur singers and authors, women, children, lots of teenagers. And he wrote all these songs down. Also, during the war, he was getting letters from Red Army soldiers writing poetry and songs about what they saw in Yiddish, and also in Central Asia. So essentially, this was a kind of huge collection of documents of first-person voices of people who couldn't use enough words to see what was happening around them, but could use existing songs and change the words a little bit, change, I don't know, pogrom to, I don't know, a white army pogrom to German pogrom, this kind of stuff, and document the hunger, abuse, rape, starvation, all these things that went on in those ghettos. Berezovsky wanted to publish all these materials as a collection after the war. He already prepared all that, but he was arrested in 1950 because Stalin started cracking down on Jewish culture, and he was on the forefront. So he was sent to Gulag, to Soviet jail, and the materials were confiscated from him, and he was told that they were destroyed. But apparently they were not destroyed. So Berezovsky died thinking all this was gone. And I came across his documents. So I worked with musicians and cultural producers to bring some of those songs to life. We did an album called Yiddish Glory, the Lost Songs of World War II, where we did 18 of those songs. Nice Jewish number. It got nominated for the Grammy, which was very, very exciting. And now we're working on another set of, recordings. I think there will be another album with two disc set with this music. And essentially, and I'm writing a book about that too, essentially that's a story of Jewish experiences of World War II in the Soviet Union through their own words. And this relationship between music and violence, why people sing for violence as opposed to telling the story, is very interesting to me because it seems like it's not hard to tell the story, but actually, if you're not used to kind of thinking about the experiences and writing them down, songs are much easier because they already have a beginning, middle, and the end. They already have villains and heroes, and all you have to do is just change the details a little bit. And that's the project about Holocaust in the Soviet Union with those first-person voices. I was also able to find some of those survivors. Some of those people interviewed in 1947. Some of them were still miraculously alive. And I met two of them, which was very exciting. To fast forward the story, one of them said to me that she didn't speak Yiddish. She didn't remember singing those songs. And she was totally shocked to find all this. I have a audio recording of her singing in 1945 at the age of 10. And she's still alive, living in Israel and all this. But anyway, it's a whole different story. And that is, to me, in some ways, like it's different from my oral histories, but not really, because it's still first-person narrative of making sense of what's happening there and documenting it for history.
Memory is such an interesting thing, I bet oral history brings that home, how deceptive memory can be.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get sidetracked because I do want to ask you if you can quote any of the Yiddish poems or songs
From
your collection.
yeah.
You can do it in Yiddish and then English.
Yeah. Maybe I will tell you that story of it's a short one. There's one note from Berdichev Ghetto. Now, Berdichev is an important Jewish town, Levi Yitzchak Berdichev and all that. But it's also
there's a great Hasidic Rebbe that's
right.
From
That's
Berdichev.
right. Hasidic center, right? And also for Soviet Jewish history, Vasily Grossman, a very important Soviet writer who wrote this very long novel called Life and Fate. He was from Berdichev. So Jews of Berdichev were rounded up by the German army right away. The Germans invaded Berdichev at the end of June 1941, and they put them all in the walls of a monastery, which became a very short-lived Berdichev ghetto that only lasted for 10 days. And everyone there was killed, including Vasily Grossman's mother. And the archive has a piece of paper with the words written by a child thrown out of the fence of this Berdichev ghetto. And it says in Yiddish, I will tell you in English because I remember that translation. It says, don't forget that we existed and how we died. And then it goes 3 times. vergess uns nicht, vergess uns nicht. Don't forget us, don't forget us, don't forget us. And that is, to my knowledge, the only document of a person who was killed in Berdichev Ghetto and he really wanted the world to know, right? So it is a miracle that this piece of paper actually ended up in the archive. But it was really important for that child to say that there. And every song in that archive, I think, is a testament to that. You know, like they want the world to know, they want us not forget. There's a similar sentiment from a massacre in Zhabokrych, another small town in Vinnytsia region of Ukraine. And it ends by saying, now what you see is now remember every word that I say. And here used to be a town of Zhabokrych, and now all you have is a cemetery. And that sentiment is that the objects, the cemetery, the dead, is not what it always was. You know, it was people,
Yeah.
it was life, and it's really, really important for them to say things like that.
What's your feeling when you read people's voices during time of such unimaginable atrocity?
I think a lot about how we have a sense of history, and when we live for historical moments, we just have to document them. And I think about those people hungry, with no hope, with understanding that maybe they will, you know, this will be like last few days of their life, and thinking my life has to mean something.
Yeah.
It's really important. And that meaning is they can do it through writing down a poem or a simple song about their existence. And this idea that we need a meaning for our life, I mean, I think that's a universal message. We all think about that, right? And thinking about these kids who really don't understand what's happening, why they're there, and still having sense of history and still thinking about the future, I don't know, people who will like learn about what happened to them through their words. To me, it's a moment I think a lot about.
It's very beautiful. It's just the human impulse is like so high,
Yeah.
even when our, on the scale of our needs, the hierarchy, the Maslow hierarchy of needs, is that how it is? Like the need to tell stories is so high. Can we wrap up with you sharing about your latest project?
Well, so my latest project, my latest is the Yiddish Glory book, which fingers crossed in a Jewish way.
In a Jewish way. Fingers crossed in a Jewish
I
way.
couldn't resist, will be done soon. But the book that I just finished and hopefully will come out soon is about post-war Jewish life in the Soviet Union. And there I'm really interested in individuals who are in this kind of position of having survived the war, miraculous. It's always a miracle that they made it. And hoping for the future where they can be in their life, but also grieving their past and their family members. And I'm looking into individuals who try to live normal life in these extraordinary circumstances, but also try to make a difference. I'm writing about, for example, psychiatrist Yosef Rebelsky, who served as a psychiatrist in the army, but when he was stationed in Vilna, encountered all these Jewish kids who survived miraculously the war, were hidden by Lithuanian peasants, and he was working with them, treating them, trying to teach them how to speak again, how to trust adults again, and working on the rehabilitation of those severely traumatized children. And that work is so important for our understanding of like post-war Jewish life and what happened there and all this. And I feel like Soviet stories of people like Rebelsky, who also, by the way, was shot by Stalin in 1949 for doing this work. Like they never got to tell their story, and their contribution to building these lives of these kids, so to I don't know, hoping for a better society, like they're unknown. So my book, I hope, will bring those stories in a relevant way to the readers and thinking about those dilemmas, hopes, and fears of Soviet Jews Unfortunately, I just wrote a new prologue and said, like, I used to worry about how will Americans ever relate to that story because it's such a different planet from American Jewish life. I no longer have this worry. You know what I mean? Unfortunately, this idea of living in a crisis, thinking about what to do, uncertain future, and all this is something we all think about now. And that's a book that of how people dealt with very similar situation in the past. So Soviet Jews before the war lived in a society where they felt completely equal to everyone else, same challenges, same opportunities, but maybe even more privilege because they took advantage of social mobility offered to them in the 30s and 20s. But then they come back after the war, and suddenly, just because they have Jewish names and Jewish noses, and that's a whole story about race and stuff being Jewish, that it suddenly become a liability. And suddenly they have to understand how to live forward, how to raise their kids, what to do, what not to do, how to survive, and all this. So I hope that the reader will find interest in that story.
I think you were writing about, correct me if I'm misquoting you, you were writing about how Jews often would talk with more heartbreak about what happened after the war because they felt like, not because it was the hardest time in their lives, but because it was the hardest to make sense of that time in their lives.
Oh, absolutely. And that's because it was the first time they were treated differently from other people. It's like, it's not just similar to like Holocaust survivors. I ask, what was the hardest thing you happened to you? And they would say, the hardest thing to me was when I immigrated to America and my landlord took
Yeah.
advantage of me. But seriously, you lived for a camp, you lived for this. It's like, this is the hardest thing that happened to you. And I think it's people like speak like this because this is the moment of unfairness of really you don't understand why it's happening to you the way that it does. That's what hit Soviet Jews, and I think that sentiment is how should I put it, resonates right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it brings us back to the whole concept of humans needing to make meaning and the world needs to make sense. And when it doesn't, that's a very particular pain.
Yeah.
So it's on a different level. Well, thank you so much for sharing so much for your time. I'm going to link your books in the video description.
Oh, thank you so much.
It was
Thank
such
you
a pleasure.